by no fault or desire of your own, you might end up feeling isolated yourself and feeling that your only help is God. Sometimes you look around and you find that even though you're surrounded by friends, you can be alone, you can be separated from them, or even from family. I looked at my own life sometimes and I find that I'm pretty much alone most of the time. I have 5 children, I've got 5 grandchildren. I love being with them and I love spending time with them. But most nights of the week I'm by myself. I think Brian and I share that. We find ourselves pretty much loners. And in that time, it's not something to be lamented, it's something to be treasured, it's something to be used, that you can find yourself in the presence of God, because that presence is never, ever far away from you. I tend to lose myself sometimes in YouTube and go down rabbit holes and discover things like Sargon I of Akkad was really the Nimrod of our Bible, and I find those sort of things exciting. And I do that when I'm by myself. And I find that by myself I have a connection to God, but that doesn't mean to say that if you are not by yourself, you can't connect with God just as well. I'm going to go through a few examples today, I think, of people who found that God chose for them to be alone at certain times. That's true of all of us. It doesn't matter where we are or what position we are in our family. All of us will find ourselves that we can be alone at times. What we've got to do is use those times. There are many characters, I think, in the Bible that I would class as loners. Elijah was one of them. Elijah, absolute loner. He did have a servant. I don't know how much he communicated with his servant or whether his servant was with him all the time. I don't know. But certainly Elijah always appears by himself. Even when he anointed Elisha didn't hang around with him. The rest of the story as you go on, Elijah is still alone. He anointed Elisha to be a prophet in his room, but Elisha's gone. And Elijah remains by himself. Who else would you think of through the pages of the Bible that might be a loner? Well, I would have picked John the Baptist, I would have thought. John the Baptist absolutely appears to me to be a loner. He lived on locusts and wild honey in the wilderness. And it would seem to me that that's probably not a shared meal. But it would appear that he was out there by himself, and yet he did have followers, but that would have been only when he presented himself to Israel. I would think that probably around about the age of 30 he made his presentation to Israel and came out to call them to repentance and to prepare them for the coming of Messiah. But until that time, I imagine, he was in the wilderness, a man alone. But being alone doesn't mean loneliness. Being alone can mean solitude. And solitude is far, far different from being lonely. Solitude is treasured when you're with God, because you're not alone. I can quote a saying of Mother Teresa, which I don't know whether it's an urban myth. I believe it's true, but maybe it was or wasn't. And they said to her, "How do you spend most of your time when you're not working for people?" And she said, "I pray." And the reporter said, "And what do you say?" She said, I don't say anything, I just listen." And they said to her, "Well, what does God say to you?" And she said, "Nothing, he just listens." There's a message there. There's a message in silence that you can communicate with God. God will be in you and helping you to understand your life and the life around you. Jesus obviously went into the wilderness at times to be alone. I don't imagine Jesus to be a gregarious sort of a person, but at the same time, I think he loved company. He selected many disciples. I don't know how many. I suspect when he came into Jerusalem, he had hundreds of disciples. I certainly know he had at least 70 that followed him around. Special 12. But he had many, many disciples. And he loved their company. How many times would he take them aside and teach them with a parable? Or say, "Don't you understand about the leaven of the scribes and Pharisees?" He loved to interact with people. And yet when the time came for him to be intimately close to God, he went off into the wilderness. He went off into a lonely place Bible says lonely place, not lonely, but an isolated place where he was with himself and God. And I think that's available to all of us. But even in the garden, even when he was at the most intimate time, when he was preparing himself for that horror which was going to come upon him, even there he wanted his friends with him. He's asked his friends to come in, and yet even though the friends were with him, when the time came to pray, he just went a little distance ahead and was alone with God. And I'm going to go back, as Brian said, into the Old Testament and look at a few people that God spoke to when they were separated and when they were alone. The first one, I guess, is really obvious, is Abraham. The call went to Abraham, leave all your family behind. Leave everybody that's related. Leave them all. And so he got up and left his town. It would have been the town of Ur in Sumer. And he left the Sumerian culture and he wandered way up the Euphrates River till he got to Haran. And that's where he left all his family. All the family he had, he left in Haran, and he came down the coast, the Mediterranean coast, down into the land of Canaan. But he was still not alone. He had his wife and he had his nephew Lot with him. And I can imagine that Lot would have been a great help to him. Lot was a wonderful person. And it must have been a great help to him to have the strength of Lot with him and Sarah, his wife. And then eventually they had to separate because Abraham had not yet become alone with God. He had not yet found himself totally alone. He still had Lot with him. And then we know that there was a fight between the herdsmen, and so Lot had to separate. Lot went down to preach in Sodom. And when Lot went down to there, Abraham was left alone with Sarah. So there were just the two of them. And then you read in chapter 13 of Genesis, the very next chapter, after Lot had separated, God renewed the promise. And God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you all of this land. I'm going to give you generations forever, as many as the stars in the sky and the sand and the sea. And I'll give you one of your generation that will bring blessings to all nations. And so he had to be alone, or was he alone? Lot had gone. He must have missed Lot. Have you ever thought about how much he missed Lot when he went? He had Sarah, and he and Sarah shared the promise. But what a good man Lot was. I can think of very few people apart from Jesus Christ who receives such a testimony as Lot did. Peter records for us, Lot was a righteous man who was distressed by the filthy lives of lawless men. For that righteous man living amongst them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Can we honestly say that about ourselves? Am I tormented day by day by the unlawful deeds I see around me? Not as much as I should be. Not as much as Lot was. And yet that was torn from Abraham. He lost that connection. And after that he met Melchizedek. Did he go with him? No. Melchizedek went back to Salem. Abraham and Sarah were left alone. And in their aloneness with God, they had nothing but trust. Trust and faith that the promise that God had given was true. And then you come to the end of Abraham's life, and he'd even been separated from Sarah. When Sarah dies, she's in another town, and Abraham has to go to bury her. I don't know why they're separated or how they're separated, but they did. And Abraham found himself absolutely alone. And yes, he did take another wife or concubine, but for that time he must have been alone and just trusted God. And it's exactly the same for us. We could find ourselves alone, or we can find ourselves in company. But you have nothing except God to trust in. And I think there are others where God has planned for them that they would be alone. Just think of Moses. Moses rode for 40 years in amongst, I suppose, a pretty busy palace. I don't know what it was like 4,000 years ago in Egypt, presume it was pretty full on. And he was raised there for 40 years, and suddenly he's taken out to the wilderness. Yes, he finds a wife, gets married and has some children, and he's obviously accepted into Jethro's family. But he would have spent most of his time in the wilderness. And then finally, after that time, he gets taken further into the wilderness and sees the burning bush, and God gives him the great promise that it is he that is going to lead the people of Israel back to their promised land, back to fulfilment of the Abrahamic promises. And poor old Moses tries to think of every possible reason he can't go. And God says, hey, I can fix it all, mate. I can cover it. Whatever is not going right, I can fix it for you. And so Moses there finally has to decide to go back and to take the people out. And when he does take them out, God takes him up into the mountain of Sinai, up into Mount Horeb. And there, when he goes up there, he is with God alone for 40 days and 40 nights. No food, no water. 40 days and 40 nights alone with God. And there he receives the oracles of God. So, there's Moses, another one that God let to go alone, separated him. So there was nothing else but just himself and God. I think of Job. Job, who had so much going for him. Job, who was covered in lovely kids and grandkids and wealth and flocks and everything you could want. And suddenly he finds himself alone. His children are all dead. His flocks are all gone. I believe there's very good evidence that his wife left him. Probably worse for him if she stayed. But the fact is that he finds himself alone, except for 3 friends who come and stay with him. And I think eventually at the end of their conversation, it made him feel more alone. They didn't understand what was going on. He couldn't communicate with them. He tried to tell them how he was feeling and they wouldn't listen. But it was not until then that, although he had heard of God with his hearing, it wasn't until then that he saw God with his eyes and he could actually see and understand God. And that was in his aloneness. Separated. He didn't have to be separated. Job was a good man. God had said to the enemy, "Have you looked at my servant Job, that there is none like him on the face of the earth? An upright man who turns his back on evil." There was nothing in Job's life that needed correcting. Nothing. And yet God took him to a position of being alone. And in that aloneness was when he understood and saw God and saw the fullness of God. How many others did God make sure that in their state of being alone, they came close to him? Poor old Joseph. Thrown down into a pit, taken down, became a slave in Egypt, worked in the household of Potiphar, got wrongly accused there, ends up in jail. How much he meant? Totally alone in jail. Totally with nothing to rely on but God. The faith that there was some plan, there was some reason for him being where he was. And then something beautiful happens. I reckon he knew the stories of his granddad. He would have been told the stories of his grandfather. He would have known that when the battle was won, that the high priest of God, the king priest of God, came with bread and wine and presented Abraham with bread and wine at the victory over the kings. He would have known that story. And who did Joseph find in jail? The bread and the wine. The butler and the baker. The butler and the baker were there as the bread and the wine before him, and he's in the pit. And the only way out of the pit is through the bread and the wine. Just imagine how he must have felt. He was alone, but he was not alone. God was there with him, saving him from where he was. And it was through the words of that butler, through the wine, that he was brought up out of the pit, raised to be at the right hand of power. Just like Jesus will be, and well, has been, but will be when he reigns at the right hand of the power of God. And so all of these people, all of them, were taken in a position where they had aloneness superimposed upon them. And I can't go past the story of Joseph without a slight plug for Mrs. Potiphar. I do think sometimes that we read the story quickly and we think that she was just a seductress. I don't think that's true. When you read the story, it says that Joseph took over all the duties of the household, and Potiphar gave no thought to anything except what he shoved in his mouth. And I can imagine him sitting back with a remote control, flicking his TV and shoving pizza into his mouth. And that was pretty much the man that he was. And it also says that Mrs. Potiphar, after a while, noticed Joseph. Now, Joseph has a unique position in the Bible. He's the only man that I know of who is described as both handsome and beautifully built. He was beautiful in face and body. Now, I would have thought that if she was just an adventuress, she would have noticed him pretty quick. But the Bible doesn't say that. It said after some time she began to notice him. I think she probably fell in love with him. But whatever the story was, whatever she did, shouldn't have done. But it was a part of God's plan. It was a part of making Joseph alone. And when he was alone, it was then that he saw the salvation of God. And it's really, I think it's a really lovely story. And then, of course, there's more. Ever thought about the life of King David? And you might think, well, David wasn't alone all that much. He was alone an awful lot of the time. David had a wretched life. He had a terrible life. Just imagine how many children he had that died. Can you imagine the tragedy in your family if you lost as many children as David had lost? David lost a child that didn't make it to 8 days old. He had a son who raped his daughter, and then another son that murdered that son. Then the captain of his guard murdered the son that had murdered the first son. How many sons were murdered? How much tragedy there was in his family. How much sadness there was. And did he have friends to fall back on? God took every one of his friends one by one. David had no one in the end. Just no one except God to fall back on. And it was nothing but he had that faith that he had to believe that God was his salvation. Ahithophel was his friend. Ahithophel was the counsel that he went to whenever he was in doubt, whenever he wanted some advice, whenever he wanted counsel about how to be close to God. It was Ahithophel. And Ahithophel turned against him. Ahithophel turned to hatred. Ahithophel never forgave him for what he did to his granddaughter. How about Abiathar? Abiathar was the priest that went through all the hard times with David, on the run, fighting the men of Saul. I have never been in battle. I have never been a soldier. But they tell me that brothers in arms forges the closest link between two men. If two men have fought together, then that gives them a union, which is like a brotherly union. And that was Abiathar. Abiathar had been David's mate. And then Abiathar turned against him. And he lost that. In his old age, he lost Abiathar. So he lost everybody in his life. Who was his most dearly loved? Who was David's closest and most loved companion? Jonathan. Jonathan died. But at least he could treasure his family. At least he could take his family and say, I can see Jonathan in them. And even Jonathan's family turned against him. Mephibosheth, if that's the way you pronounce it, I don't know. he turned against him and tried to support Absalom in the rebellion, so that eventually David lost even the friendship of Jonathan's family. David had nothing. Had the relationship with some of his wives, and I hope that was good. I like to think he had a really good relationship with Abigail. But I don't know. But he lost those most dearly loved in his life, and he found himself totally alone with God. And now we come to maybe the reading that we had, and maybe my favourite loner of all of them. I haven't talked about John the Baptist, so maybe I'll do him a little bit later. I don't have much to say, a little bit, except I don't like his name. We've got to make sure we change it. Not the John bit. That's all right. Okay. Have a look at the life of Elijah. Elijah was the quintessential loner. Yes, he did have a servant, and I don't know how much he interacted with that, but Elijah was by himself every time he stood up before the kings and he pronounced the word of the Lord and he brought down fire from heaven. He was the absolute loner. And the passage we read, there he was, again alone, led by God. Where did he come from? We don't even know where he came from. He had no family. He blew in from the desert. We don't know where he came from. He's got no lineage. He's got no town. There's only 4 or 5 prophets in the whole of the Bible that have no connection to town or lineage, and Elijah's one of them. And you might say, but wasn't he a Tishbite? Doesn't that mean he came from Tishba? No, it doesn't. If you do a careful search on Tishba, you'll find it never existed. There is no Tishba. There's a reference by Josephus that was made up 600 years later. There's a reference in the book of Tobit. None of them can be believed. People have tried to find out. There is no Tishba. If you go back to 1 Kings 17, I'll just read one verse. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. If you get your Strongs and have a look at the word Tishba, it doesn't mean, or Tishbite, it doesn't mean from a town at all. It means the strangers, the sojourners, the non-indigenous people. That's what Tishba means. It means non-indigenous. It means he was a stranger. He didn't belong there. And it says he was of the inhabitants of Gilead. That word inhabitant occurs 15 times in the Old Testament, and every single time it is translated stranger, except here, because they didn't want to call Elijah a stranger, but that's what he was. He was a non-indigenous stranger, a sojourner, someone who did not belong in Israel. I'm absolutely convinced he was a Gentile. Even his name calls it out. Just imagine his name. He was living in amongst a group of people. Some said, Molech is my God. Some said, Marduk is my God. Elijah's name proclaimed, Yah is my God. Now he came from nowhere. He had no lineage. And here he is, totally alone, not even friends within Israel. No one. And he goes out, and here we find him out in the desert, and God sends an angel to feed him with bread and water. Bread and water, the bread of life and the water of life. What more do you need? And he went for 40 days, and God must have been directing him, because it doesn't say he decided where to go. And he knew where he was going. He was going down to the Sinai Peninsula. He was headed to Mount Horeb. When do you think the shekel dropped? That he was the second person to go for 40 days and 40 nights up on Mount Horeb. Moses had been there. Moses had been on Mount Horeb for 40 days and 40 nights, fed by God. And here was Elijah walking in his footsteps. And from this point onward, Elijah and Moses are intimately connected through the rest of the Bible. Okay, Elijah and Moses. Elijah goes up on the mountain, and what happens? There's earthquake, wind and fire. Did Moses get earthquake, wind and fire? Absolutely. When Moses was on the mountain, it shook with an earthquake. There was a column of fire on top, and there was a blast of trumpets. You can't have trumpets without wind. Earthquake, wind and fire was on Moses, and it was on Elijah. But God made a really important pronouncement. He said to Elijah, I'm not in it anymore. I'm not in the earthquake, wind and fire. The earthquake, wind and fire was the covenant to Israel. It was God's signature on that covenant as he took Israel to be his bride at Sinai. And now he was saying to Elijah, the new Moses, I'm not in that covenant anymore. Jeremiah said it in chapter 3. I took that faithless woman Israel out into the wilderness and I wrote her a bill of divorce. I divorced her. And then he said to Elijah, but there are 7,000 who still love me by faith. That's where I am. That's my covenant. My covenant is now a covenant of faith. It's not in the bloodline of Israel anymore. And he gave Elijah a really curious job to do. Yes, anoint Elisha, that's all right. Anoint Jehu to be king of Israel, that's okay. But anoint Hazael to be king over Syria? Why is God anointing Syrian kings? Because it's all changed. Because everything's now changed. The gospel is going to spread out. It's now a gospel of faith. And Jesus brought up this very point. Did you know that this was the first time they tried to kill Jesus? Was when he made this very point. He said, I tell you that there were many widows in the time of Elijah, but God only sent him to a Lebanese one. What? The Jews said? A Lebanese one? And then Jesus said, I tell you there were many people with leprosy in Israel, but Elisha was only sent to a Syrian. Jesus was telling him the gospel had gone out. From the time of these prophets, the gospel was spreading. And they hated him for it. They took Jesus to the edge of a cliff and tried to throw him off. And yet this was what Elijah got out of his solitude. This is what he got out of his message of being alone with God. There were some other messages. Like get up, dust yourself off, get out and start working again. There's more work to be done. Stop feeling sorry for yourself. There was all of that in the message, and so he went. And then he anoints Elisha, but they don't operate together, they separate. He anoints Elisha, and then they separate, and they go off their separate ways. And there's more work for Elisha to do, but the only time they get back together again is when Elijah is taken. Elijah is finally taken, leaving Elisha as the new prophet. But that's the only time they're together. And all of this was a message for Elijah. Where do you see Elijah again? When he's taken? He's taken up by a whirlwind. Where does he turn up again? With Moses. He turns up on the Mount of Transfiguration. Moses and Elijah standing next to Jesus, representing the resurrected saints, representing the kingdom. Why was there Moses and Elijah? People have said it represents the law and the prophets. Oh, that's just not right. Elijah never ever made a prophecy about Jesus. If you wanted to represent the law and the prophets pointing to Jesus, you would have picked an Isaiah to be up there. No, that wasn't the reason. Elijah was there because he represented all of the saints who were outside the fold of Israel. Elijah was a Gentile. And he represented the spirit and the power of God going beyond the borders of Israel, going up to Hazael and going up to Naaman and going up to the widow of Zarephath. That was Elijah's group. So there with Jesus was the saints from Israel and the saints of faith from outside of Israel. Now, is that the end? Do Moses and Elijah ever turn up again? They certainly do. Revelation chapter 11. They turn up again. The two witnesses. One witness has the power to stop the rain from heaven by the space of 3.5 years. Who's that? That's Elijah. The other witness has the power to turn water into blood and to curse the world with all manner of plagues. Who's that? Moses. So Moses and Elijah are together again. And why? Because they were both alone with God. Both of them spent that time alone with God. And you can do it. I can do it. Do it in the shopping centre. I can do it driving. I've got to be careful of that. I did go through a red arrow the other day. I've got to make sure I concentrate on my driving. But you can. You can be with God alone at any time. So, I've got a PowerPoint here with one picture. I'm not going to disappoint you, there are more pictures. And you might think, I hope this talk doesn't go on too much longer. But the fact is that there's one more person I'd like to talk about. It's Jonah. Now, Jonah was alone, not by his own desire. Man, God really fished him out. God really chased Jonah to make sure that he did what God wanted him to do. But I'm going to say something about Jonah. We haven't got time to talk a lot about him, but if you want to learn the story of Jonah, it doesn't start in the book of Jonah. The story of Jonah starts in 2 Kings under the reign of Jeroboam II. That's where he gets his first mention, and that's important, what happens to him there. Anyway, so Jonah, as I said, I never warmed to him. Yes, he tried to get away from God. He tried to run away. He didn't want to preach to the people of Nineveh. But can you see that this was also the time after Elijah when God's grace was going out beyond Israel? What had God got to do with the people of Nineveh? Why did God want to send a prophet to Nineveh to convert them? Because we're now into the beginnings of the gospel of grace. It's beginning to move out to the Gentiles. They're all now being called. Jonah didn't want any part of that. He wanted to smash them. And I think the worst bit about Jonah is when you get to the point where he gets angry because the people aren't killed. He's sitting up there on the mountain and he's watching and he says, I know what's going to happen. I told you this would happen, God. I told you they'd all repent. And he was really angry. And then God made the plant and died and he got angry about that as well. So then he spent his whole life angry. But then it stops. God says, don't you think I should care about these people who don't know their right hand from their left and all their cows? Why shouldn't I worry about them? What's the answer from Jonah? Dead silence. It's not actually. There's something beautiful. And it's in the slides. The story of Jonah doesn't stop. The story of Jonah is still going to this day. Let me see if I can press the right arrow. Does that work? Yeah. That building is around about the old photograph. And I can probably read what it says. I have to turn around. Let me see. It says, yeah, that's Jonah's tomb. Jonah's tomb is in the city of Mosul, and the city of Mosul is Nineveh. Joseph's tomb is in Nineveh. What does that tell you? Well, the first thing it tells me is, well, maybe it really is or isn't Jonah's tomb. It's very ancient. It seems to go back many thousands of years into antiquity. Maybe Jonah's tomb, but they all claim it is. Everybody says it is, and everybody who can remember the ancient stories say, this is Jonah's tomb. What does that tell you about him? He never went back. He stayed in Nineveh. He became a prophet to Nineveh. What a turnabout that was. Just imagine what a huge change in life that was. You left everybody you've had, everybody you've known, your family, everyone, you've left them behind and chosen to be a missionary to Nineveh. So that's what it looked like 100 years ago. Just got to make sure I press the right thing. That's a more modern photograph. I think this is about 2013, yeah. That's what the tomb of Jonah looks like in Nineveh, still in Nineveh. But then it was taken over by ISIS when ISIS took over the top part of Iraq. And that's what ISIS did to it. They blew it up in 2014, destroyed it. Why? Well, in fact, it was a mosque. Why would they blow up a mosque? What had happened to the tomb? The tomb of Jonah went back to antiquity, but then when the Christians took over in the time of the Byzantine Empire, they turned it into a church in commemoration of Jonah. Then when the Muslims took over about 1,000 years ago, they turned it into a mosque. So why did ISIS blow up a mosque? Well, presumably that mosque was Shia and they were all Sunni. And so they just love to blow up anything that's not the right religion. You can't imagine any Christian churches doing that, can you? I'd imagine there'd be plenty of Catholic and Protestant churches blow each other up if they had half the chance back in the last 2,000 years. Okay, so they blew it up. Here it is today. Still, the gates are still there. The gate is still there. It's full of rubble. But the body of the building's blown up. But it still stands as a monument that Jonah was there. But here's the best thing. When the people, all the builders came along to clean out the rubble and to start looking to rebuild, they found something wonderful. As they dug underneath Jonah's tomb, this is what they found. They found under there Esarhaddon's palace, the palace of the king of Assyria. 670 BC was under Jonah's tomb. Now, you might say to yourself, well, Jonah was around about 750 BC, and if the tomb was on top of the king who was 670 BC, then Jonah's tomb must have come later than when he died. And that's perfectly true. It was very common for a person to die like Jonah, who at the time would have certainly been revered, but they didn't want to make a huge deal out of him. They didn't want to make a huge statue of him or anything. So they probably kept his bones in what they called an ossuary in those days, just a box of bones. But 200 or 300 years, when the story becomes embellished, they decide to build the tomb. And there's Jonah's tomb to this day. Still there. And that's a relief from the side underneath Jonah's tomb of the Assyrians. Those were the ones he preached to. Those were the ones that he came to because God had made him experience solitude, aloneness. I can't imagine what's more alone than living for 3 days inside a tuna. Just imagine what you'd smell like when you came out. He must have experienced incredible loneliness. And yet that's what God gave him to turn him around. And I think Jonah did get turned around. I see Jonah as being a great example of someone who, because of the time he was alone with God, it changed him. It didn't change him immediately. He was alone with God in the fish's stomach. And then he was alone with God in Nineveh, but he was still angry. He still wanted the Ninevites to be killed. But when they repented, and when God spent time alone with him, he turned. And I think he probably spent the rest of his life there as a missionary, preaching to the people of Nineveh. And like always, it worked for a time. It didn't work forever. The people of Nineveh soon deserted God. But there's a message, I think, for all of us. The message that we turn now to the table of the Lord. We turn now to our memorials in front of us, and we sort of think that there is a time for solitude. There's a time when we have to spend alone, as Jesus was in the garden when he separated from his friends. Doesn't mean to say we have to separate from the people we love and around us, but it does mean that there is time for us to be alone, and it's a good time because that's the time when God can teach us, when God can take us, can teach us, and hopefully, if we are receptive, that's the time when we will learn most of the lessons that God has to teach us.